When you upload a video to YouTube, you can't predict what folks will pick up on. When I put up a video last week of myself and fellow YouTuber Mike from Autistic AF having a chat in Bristol, there were more comments about one small section at the beginning than any other.
We had a fun chat. I remember when we mentioned about stories, I said that thing to you where, often you get derided when somebody tells you a story from their personal life. Maybe it's got some sort of emotional sort of component to it, and then you respond with a story of your own.
Mm-hmm.
Big faux pas. No. Except.
Exactly, when you're dealing with somebody who speaks and communicates in the same way as you do.
Yeah.
Some viewers weren't aware that this trait is an autism thing, whilst others knew about it but still enjoyed seeing it being discussed openly. A few commenters weren't quite so happy though. They weren't asked for their wisdom, but they were all too keen to offer sage advice on how both Mike and I might sharpen up our social skills. One in particular.
When people want empathy and autistics tell them stories about their lives, they're just blackcatting. It's selfish and steals all the attention.
If the phrase blackcatting is unfamiliar to you, it refers to a specific kind of boasting and insensitivity, and it pops up quite often in discussions about narcissism. When someone seeks to gain social advantage by consistently claiming to outdo their companions, they're blackcatting. My black cat is blacker than your black cat, being the phrase at its heart. I've talked to hundreds of autistic people over the last 40 years. And I've no doubt that what Mike and I described is really common amongst us, and that it has no relation to boasting, selfishness, or a desire for attention. But if that's what some commenters really think, then perhaps it's time we took another look at autism and empathy. I'm Quinn, and I'm autistic. And today on Autistic, we're asking, how does autistic empathy work? Empathy is actually a much broader concept than most people realise, and it's one us autistic creators talk about more than we'd like to, but sadly, we keep on having to put the record straight. I've done several videos on empathy before, and even Mike did a video about empathy only last week in response to something said by a poorly informed celebrity. For decades, psychiatric and mental health professionals have described empathy as divided into two distinct categories. Affective empathy is what's going on when you pick up how someone may be feeling from mainly nonverbal signals. It's emotional intuition, the vibe you pick up from someone, or the temperature of the room, and it helps us to know when people don't actually mean what they say. The second category is the more thoughtful, cognitive empathy. When we apply our knowledge of the world and how folks usually behave to work out not only feelings but what people might be thinking or intending to say or do, we're exercising our cognitive empathy. Candidates for further categories of empathy have come and gone over the years, but recently a strong contender for a third place in the empathy leaderboard has emerged. Compassionate empathy is actually what most people are thinking of when they use the word empathy in conversation. When someone is in trouble, down on their luck, or in pain, it's compassionate empathy that makes us want to help out. It's what motivates us to give of ourselves for the benefit of others. Why we give to charity, pick up fallen comrades, or give our loved one the bigger slice of cake rather than taking it for ourselves. I did a video a while back about a study in which autistic people were shown to be significantly more compassionate and altruistic than the non-autistic folks they were compared to. When social pressure was taken out of the equation and the test subjects were tested just on their own kindness and self-sacrifice, the autistic ones consistently come out as what would normally be thought of as more caring than the others. Of course, this being a study on the big, bad, scary, deficit-ridden autism, it was then summarised as a fault. A lack of appropriate selfishness and mistrust, rather than a net positive for kindness and charity. Efforts to disprove those initial findings haven't succeeded yet. But whilst compassionate empathy is actually a strong point for us, cognitive empathy can be a different matter. We're at a disadvantage then, and comments like this one demonstrate that. The problem here is not just one of compassion, but of communication and mismatched cognitive needs. There is a potential lack of compassion here, but not on the part of the autist being criticised. If we take away all the categories and subtleties, the broad definition of empathy boils down to having an awareness of how somebody else might be feeling, thinking, or motivated. It's a survival mechanism that's been with us since before we came down from the trees. Feelings can be infectious for everyone. That's why so many people pay a fortune for live events or cinemas instead of watching on their large screen TVs in the comfort of their own homes. We want the atmosphere, the feeling of being there. The very specific emotional high that we only get from sharing our enjoyment with others is an aspect of affective empathy. When you hear of autists being described as hyper-empathic, this affective variety of empathy is what we're talking about. Hyper-empaths are extremely sensitive to the feelings of others, and it can be difficult to manage in real time. We can be flooded with conflicting emotions from different points of view. It's not some mystical power. It's just unconscious observations of others' feelings making a direct connection with our own emotional states. That autistic folks can be more adversely impacted by emotional displays from others has been documented for decades, as have been many of our reactions in the form of meltdowns, shutdowns, situational mutism, and alexithymia. High levels of autistic compassion and the desire to help others have again been documented for decades under a different guise. Instead of generosity, selfless detachment, kindness, or altruism, it's been depicted as gullibility, lack of boundaries, naivety, unhealthy disinterest in wealth and status, or even occasionally malicious interference. And it's been exploited by the unscrupulous to our cost as both individuals and as a neurotype. Even though compassion is what most people think about when they talk of empathy these days, whenever anyone gives us an example of an autist supposedly lacking empathy, they almost always focus on cognitive empathy problems, misunderstandings and assumptions rather than any act of cruelty or neglect. And this comment is exactly that. In criticising autistic empathy, it's demonstrated an astounding lack of self-awareness. It's either making incorrect assumptions about our intent or misrepresenting the situation. In whichever form it takes, empathy is about considering and understanding the feelings of others. When someone is in distress, autistic folks will likely sense it as well as anyone else does, sometimes even more so, but the way we show it is different. What the commenter is talking about is actually a communication issue. Empathy isn't really what's at stake here. They're saying one thing, but they're also confirming something plenty of us worked out a long time ago. Sometimes people put out signals that they want empathy or sympathy, when what they really want is a performative act to bolster their egos. Empty words and ritual responses, and if you come to me for that, let's just say you could make a much better choice. I'm autistic, so I don't just get this, to me, weird obsession with who's more justified than who. My instinct is always to first clarify your situation and how you're feeling to build mutual understanding, establish we're on the same page. Then try to reason a practical step towards bettering your circumstances. I've tried doing the there, poor you routine that people have tried on me, and I don't know, maybe because I don't like it myself, I don't know what other people expect, but people never like it when I try to do it. My practical approach is nothing like the folksy empathy act most people expect, but they usually recognise it for the genuine desire to understand and spread the load that it is. But If I was in any doubt about what might be festering in the minds of those folks who do have a problem with my autistic empathic response, then this comment would have pointed me in the right direction. Mike and I have a lot in common, but we're also very different. We're in a similar ballpark of intellect and temperament, and of course there's all that we share by dint of both being autistic, and maybe ADHD too. But our backgrounds and personal histories are worlds apart. I'm a good decade older than Mike for a start. He was born in a different country to me. His family life was very different to mine, and he's worked in IT all his life, whilst I used to be in healthcare. There are countless differences between us, and despite our ease with each other on screen, our first physical meeting was only a few hours before that was filmed. Yet, throughout our meeting, and since, I get a deep feeling of both understanding and of being understood, because Mike communicates with me in a way which feels natural to both of us. Since this was our first face-to-face meeting, we were maybe a bit more candid than we normally are in emails or Zoom chats. We opened up about some of the things we don't talk about on screen as we stepped over that threshold from peers and associates to friends. We did that through stories. I've got a lot going on in the background that I don't talk about on screen. Regular viewers know about some of it, but there are things you only share with friends, people you feel will keep a confidence. Each time I told Mike something about my life, he responded with a tale of his own. Sometimes his story was more remarkable than mine, his triumph greater or his loss deeper. In others, I was the most impacted by whatever it was we were talking about. But there was never any sense between us that either of us wanted to outdo the other. Nor were any demands being made or expectations floated about how we should respond to each other. At one point, I got a bit emotional talking about something that's going on right now, and Mike responded to me the same way I would to someone in distress. He listened, he showed me he understood, and offered something practical and useful. If what that commenter said was right, I wouldn't have been describing Mike as a friend just now. He demonstrated his friendship by responding the way that I needed him to. And it wasn't with a, there, I'm sure it'll get better, nor even a, oh, it must be so hard for you right now. He showed me he cared by giving me an analogue. When I talked about how I was feeling and coping, he talked of a time he faced a different but vaguely similar dilemma. In expressing his parallel experiences, he told me in an instant that he understood not only the mechanics of the situation, but of how I might be feeling. He didn't have to say, oh, but not as bad as yours, or like yours only worse. He didn't have to. I can make my own judgment on that. But he made it clear that whilst details and degree might not match, he understood both my quandary and my emotional state. He exercised his autistic empathy and expressed it in autistic language, so I felt better, and it brought us closer. But more than that, he tried to help me reason things out, keep things in perspective, and offer practical advice of how I might make this difficult time a little bit easier. This comment illustrates the double empathy problem so well, because it shows us how it's more than just a question of feelings and comprehension, but one of communication. The commenter thinks we're wrong to reminisce about personal experiences when told an emotional story because it takes attention away from the storyteller. And they're right, but only in very specific circumstances. Yes, I've discovered to my cost that some people only want sympathetic noises when they've a sorry tale to tell, or plenty of compliments and celebration when they're feeling chuffed with themselves. But they're not seeking empathy. They just want to be told they're right to feel the way they feel. They do that with an arm round the shoulder and a comforting word, or a fist pumping and telling you you're so talented. not by telling you a story of their own. I'm autistic though, and that's the last thing I want from you when I'm emotional. I want rationality. I want you to show me that you understand by telling me a tale. Sympathetic noises won't help me to fix my problem and might actually make me feel like you don't care because you're not offering me anything useful. Cognitive empathy is about working out what other people might be thinking or feeling or wanting, but it's heavily biased by our own feelings and habits. Because I don't personally want people to commiserate or celebrate with me every time I tell them something of note, it doesn't naturally occur to me that someone else might want it. Not when I was younger, anyway. I have learned over decades of mistakes, though, that sometimes that's what people do want, and when I recognise that's what they want from me, I try to provide it. If they don't send me the right signals, though, or I don't pick up on them, I'm going to react the way I want people to when I'm in need of validation, and that is by telling you a story to show I relate to your situations and feelings. In the commenter scenario, my failure to react as they consider appropriate, with platitudes and sycophancy, betrays my deficiency. It shows that I'm unaware of or unwilling to indulge their need for me to respond the way they want me to. I am the insensitive one. They probably think that if they posted their story on Reddit on the "Am I the asshole" bit, they'd come out smelling of roses. But would they? Maybe those Redditors would see it differently. They might wonder why my clear signals of understanding and desire to help were being rejected. Maybe our commenter would actually be the asshole in their eyes. Or perhaps pointing fingers doesn't help us at all. There's failures on both sides of the fence, and in multiple ways, so the fault can't be tied down to one party or the other. It's a double empathy problem. Both sides came in with different expectations that weren't met, and we could both come out of it looking foolish, depending on who's looking. The subject of autistic empathy is a huge one, and we'll be talking about it for years to come, which is, at least from my viewpoint, a tragedy of its own. Autistic people know that this whole concept of us lacking empathy is flawed. We know the score, but for some reason, the folks who are most keen to criticise us for lacking empathy, including many of those setting research agendas and making policy recommendations to governments, seem very reluctant to exercise any of it towards understanding us. I always find myself led to the same question. I've spent over 50 years learning and adapting to typical expectations that I can't relate to because I'm autistic, which puts me in a minority. I had to work much of it out for myself through trial and error, despite being diagnosed in the 80s, and it's been a steep learning curve. But I've always tried to adapt to people's expectations, to anticipate needs that I don't feel myself. We call it masking, and every autist knows how draining that is. But when I meet up with folks I don't have to mask with, it's much easier to communicate and feel understood. The mask never drops completely, not at my age, but enough that I don't feel on edge. I'm not hanging on every word expecting to clarify and defend myself at every turn. Until recently, finding non-autistic people who get us and who can communicate with us on a mutually respectful, equally accommodating level was next to impossible. But they're still a rare find, a precious commodity. Will I ever live to see a day in which everyone understands double empathy? I'm Quinn, and I'm autistic. Thank you for watching. If you've already liked and subscribed and would like to support the channel more, then please follow the Patreon links in the description to pledge what you feel is fair and affordable to help keep the lights on here and the content keep flowing.